Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
Shout out to all of you guys who showed support on our last video. That was one of our most successful videos in a long time. You guys really enjoyed it. Showed out with the likes, even some comments, and definitely the views. So like we normally do when we have a comment, we read comments on our recent videos. So if you want your comment read like the one we're about to read, please do comment and we will for sure be on the lookout for it and read it out on the next episode. Like I said on our last episode, James Wiseman fan, he commented on our last video and said Boston is going to lose again. Nobody can beat Denver. Yeah, pretty much seems that way. And heading into the playoffs, I think that's a pretty fair assessment considering the regular season matchups that we've seen and just how Denver's looked against even other teams. So let us know if you agree with James Wiseman fan in the comments. And before we get started with today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Lost 2 games since the All-Star break, so
yeah,
and they were basically right at the end.
Yeah.
So, but moving on into the next topics, right? So we got a big one coming out. So it's actually really funny because we did a video a while ago. I want to say it was probably at least a couple months ago. Kind of talking about like how we were kind of down on G League Ignite just as a whole, right? In the process, I think you kind of even referred to it sort of as like a scam of sorts, or at the very least, just neither of us were very high on it, right? We talked about, how there's been some decent players that have come out, right? Like, Jonathan Kuminga, Jalen Green. I guess we'll see where Scoot goes, right? It's early. But then for every one of those guys that comes out, right, then there's other guys, that ended up, not panning out, right, quite as much, right? Like, say like a Dacian Nix, or others like that, right? Like it happens, right? And some other guys, right? Like even this year haven't really played, right? Like say a Leonard Miller, somebody like that. But I mean, and then even other guys in the past, Isaiah Todd, not a Wizards favorite, right?
Yeah,
So,
nobody, I think, in the DMV really cares for that guy right now. But, I do hope he does get a job somewhere else, but it's not with the Wizards, please. That was a really tumultuous time for our draft picks and stuff like that.
Yeah, but according to, The Athletic, and Woj and others, right? So the NBA G League Ignite is pretty much done, after this season, right? So it's going to be shut down, right? According to the president of the G League, Ignite program or whatever, Sharif Abdur-Rahim, right? Former NBA player.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's only been what, 4 years?
Yeah.
And as we already know, right, it was kind of presented, as sort of an opportunity, for guys to come out of high school and rather than, go through college, and not be able to do, much financially with that, you can kind of just go into an NBA program, right, and kind of cash in early.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that's been cited, right, as one of the big reasons, right, which again, I don't think is the only reason. I think it has to also do with some of the quality of the talent. But regardless, um, one of the biggest cited reasons they've been saying is that it's because of the NIL policies in college, right? For NCAA's name, image, likeness policy, right? Now the players, right, in college can make money, off of themselves, which is a great thing. But obviously that kind of makes it a little bit pointless, right? To go into the G League Ignite. Because just in general, right, like, the college teams and the college pools and programs, right, they just have more notoriety.
Sure.
And now that you can make a lot of money, by playing college sports, I mean, like, there's just not as much of a point. Again, I also think it has to do with, I think it's been a little bit of a failure, in terms of developing talent. Again, not that everybody is bad, right? But, the names that we mentioned, those are their best players. And the other players that were better, right, were not part of the G League Ignite, right? They went to, either college or they came from overseas, right? Like Jalen Green's teammate, Alperen Şengün, right? He came overseas from Turkey, right? Then obviously like, a Cade Cunningham, right? I think most people like better than Jalen Green, right? That was the number 1 pick, right? He came out of college.
Yeah.
And others, right? So I mean, we'll see. Adam Silver mentioned, he said, "quote I'm not sure what the future of Team Ignite will be because before I felt there was a hole in the marketplace we were filling. Now my focus is turning to earlier development of those players. This was said around All-Star weekend, a month or so ago.
Hmm.
Um, so they may kind of try to do something else. Obviously we know with the overtime elite basketball, right? That's kind of like for the high schooler prep to pro people,
Hmm.
right? So maybe they might do something like that. Because because like the foundation of it may not necessarily like be completely scrapped. Like obviously G League Ignite will be gone, but they may try to do something else. But again, kind of go on and kind of rip into us for this one, because again, neither you nor I were, we were kind of talking about on a whim before we recorded that specific podcast.
Yeah,
You can go back to look at it if you want, but like I said, neither of us were very high on the G League Ignite thing. Anyways, at the time, when it was first announced, it was pretty cool, and that was
sure.
before I believe the NIL stuff was kind of like widespread.
Well before,
So
yeah.
because even that was only a recent thing.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, like, I was thinking about it in my head. I didn't even tell you this, but when we were going to get closer to the draft and things like that, because we were going to talk about guys like Ron Holland, and Mataz, like, I was going to kind of talk about the G League and talk about the problems that it does have and why those prospects may not be the kinds of guys that you want to have in the top five picks, or maybe even a lottery. Like, who knows? But yeah, I think there were a lot of problems with the G League. I do want to start with the positives first. Like you said, it was pretty much there to fill that void of the NIL deals and players being able to play and make money, because we all know that the NCAA was pretty much exploiting kids for generations. They weren't allowed to make money, anything like that, and the repercussions on those kids were pretty severe. So it was nice to see kids be able to get paid to play basketball, have living quarters. I think they were even allowed to get degrees in certain fields and things like that. So it had a lot going for it. Also, you get a certain spotlight that I think you reach a different demographic than you would if you're playing for college or overseas. But to get into the problems, like, first of all, if you look at the environments between, I guess, the G League, college, and overseas, right? The G League games, they're pretty meaningful. I would say the EuroLeague games are very meaningful. They have some very passionate fan bases. Hundreds of tournaments, hundreds of championships, countrywide, worldwide. It's a global sport. Then college, obviously, you have the NCAA tournament. You have all the regular season games. You have all the stuff leading up towards that. But then with the G League Ignite, they're not even technically a part of the G League because they were playing in exhibition games. Those games are pretty much meaningless games, built for players to kind of create their own highlight reel, if that makes sense. Like, if you look at like a guy like Ron Holland, like, I'm not like using him to like bash the G League, but you just have to look at the truth. Like, he's a freak athlete. He showcases that night in and night out. But what more does he showcase in terms of that? Is it going to translate to winning basketball? We don't know, because it's not meaningful basketball. They're playing against G League talent in exhibition games. I just don't know how to feel about that. Regardless, I think, I guess you can feel okay about it, considering that there are a bunch of guys from the G League Ignite that are in the league, but some of them haven't really panned out. Some of them are kind of shaky. Some of them are good. I guess like Jalen Green, he's been balling on another level recently. But before that, people were kind of skeptical of him, considering him like an AAU player and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But what were you going to say?
That was a guy that I think, there were kind of been, a lot of people, covering the league kind of talking about the idea of like, maybe Houston should kind of move on from him, because we kind of did a couple of trade segments, talking about like, would the Rockets actually trade, a guy like a Jalen Green, right? Who it seemed like, has promise or, some talent, right? But hasn't been able to completely put it together, other than, again, of course, he's been playing great. As of late, this is probably like some of the best basketball he's played.
Yeah.
And there's other reasons for that, right? Because the team's changed since Shingun went down, right? They're playing smaller, they're playing faster, but still.
Yeah, and it's crazy. Like, and then you have guys like Scoot. And Scoot, I think, is kind of similar to what Ron Holland is right now, where you've got a great athlete, but what more can he do? He didn't adjust, Scoot, that is, very well to NBA defenses at times. It took him a while to get into his groove, and then even then, it still hasn't been amazing. It's just not been what was advertised. And, like you said, we previously talked about it. And I even said that it was more of like a scam because it just felt like we weren't getting what was advertised, in which players were being developed and they were learning how to win and play meaningful basketball. It just seemed like it was kind of like an easy way for players to get money and endorsements while also being able to play and not face scrutiny. But now you have the emergence of the NIL where people are making, even more money than what the guys were in the G League Ignite. Like, Bronny is out here with like a 4.5 or almost 5 million, I think, NIL net worth or whatever. And then Rob Dillingham is at $1 million. Like, they just keep going up. And like, I think Skims even partnered with a bunch of the college guys recently. So it's wild, like, to think about how much money there is available to college players now. So it kind of makes the G League Ignite irrelevant. I think a rework would be very nice where, like Adam Silver said, we need to kind of focus and hone in more on the young development aspect. Because I know the G League Ignite, they do have like veterans and former players and just guys who've been in the G League situation for a long time, but like it just didn't translate to the NBA all that well. Like Kuminga, I think, is a standout guy where you look at his numbers and he's finally piecing it together, but it took him a while to get to where he is. Yeah. So I think those guys that are in the G League, I think they're the rawest of the raw. They have a lot of upside and potential. It's just, I think they could have been even better quicker if they had gone to college or came from overseas. That's kind of how I feel about it.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, again, like, we've already mentioned, some of the guys, that were on the list, right? Because again, you mentioned Green, Kaminga, and Scoot, right? And obviously, like, it's not fair necessarily for the guys coming in, this year, just because, again, like, they're rookies. So it's like,
Sure.
just because somebody, like, say, like, you, Scoot, or like, say, even though people probably feel like he's been underwhelming as a rookie, like, I don't think you can just be out on a guy,
No.
6 months into his career. Like,
Agreed.
obviously, like, what if year 2 comes around and all of a sudden, he's crazy? Because, like you mentioned with Kaminga, right? It took him 3 years. And actually, right, even going into the season, right, when the season began, right, he wasn't the guy who's playing now.
Right.
He didn't become that basically until, a few months ago.
Right.
It wasn't like he started off the season, playing that, right? Because we had to get to this point, where he basically called out Steve Kerr, and said, you got to play me more, right? So, I mean,
yeah.
That's the thing with the G League Ignite, where, like you said, hopefully it can be reworked into a better version where you can take guys, that are first coming into the league, or maybe even those, high school guys, whatever, and then we're focused on early development, right?
Right.
Because again, like, and like, just in general, that's the other part of the draft and young players that's also difficult, anyways, is that you just never know, right? Like, it's very rare that, like, you have a guy, in the draft where you're immediately like, there's no way that this guy is going to be anything less than great, right? Like, that's very rare. So you
Right.
kind of have to look at it from that perspective too. But you would think, like, the development early on would go, a long way towards at least getting close to whatever it is their ceiling could be. So hopefully they kind of learn from the mistakes of G League Ignite, and do something else. Because again, it's not something that you have to completely scrap. Because again, it gives people more options, right? Because again, like in college, right, you can obviously, make money, while you play, which is cool, which is great. And obviously in college, like, ideally, right, like they are, put into, like the fitness programs and whatnot, right? And then, ideally they're kind of learning, but like, there's still nothing like being able to adjust to NBA basketball. And we know, like, there's certain schools that generally have like a better reputation for prepping NBA players than maybe some others. Not that you have to go to a specific school in order to be in the NBA, but just in general, we know the NBA has the money and the resources to do something good and productive. So hopefully they can kind of, move on, like, analyze what worked, what didn't, and then, build a better product. Because that's kind of ultimately the goal, is to build a better product.
Yeah, and the hilarious thing is, or not hilarious, I shouldn't say hilarious, but it is intriguing. I think the G League Ignite's purpose may have been to just really force the hand for all this NIL stuff in terms of college basketball.
Right.
Like, that might have been like the underlying.
That was kind of
What'd you say?
Yeah, because that was the initial thing. It was supposed to be that they were going to get paid.
Yeah, exactly. So that could have been it, like, where they just forced their hand. Because I'm telling you, like, the NCAA, they lost out on a lot of money because a lot of these stars, these young stars, decided to go to the G League Ignite instead of the NCAA. Like now people wouldn't be tuned into certain schools because a guy's going to the G League Ignite versus where they had previously been committed to. Like a guy like Jalen Green, like regardless of how you feel about him, there's times when he's pretty much box office. But, you know, and that would have really helped out a lot of the schools in the NCAA potentially. But, you know, it is what it is. I'm just curious to see what the future is going to hold for kind of the whole system. Like, are they going to dial back on the NIL? Are they going to place like extreme restrictions on guys because of ego and stuff like that? Is the NBA kind of going to have to come back in there and force their hand again? Who knows? But it is kind of intriguing. And I think it's also very interesting that they shut it down fairly early. 4 years is kind of wild. I would have expected maybe 5, 6, but 4 is kind of crazy to me. But regardless, I mean, you do still have some decent talent coming out, I think, you know, in terms of Mataz, Ron Holland. Like, these guys could be really good. It's just a matter of, you know, did the G League Ignite do their job in preparing these guys? That's the only thing that I'm really concerned about.
Right, because, like, you know, even with the 4 years, it wasn't like they just woke up today and decided to end it, right? Like, I'm sure that they had already kind of been thinking about, like, yeah, this isn't working, so we're probably going to have to put a stop to it, which basically
Right.
would be like 3 years, kind of, which, you know, that's a very short amount of time. Um, but again, if something doesn't work, right, sometimes you kind of just have to pull the plug.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes and kind of admit defeat and kind of take the L. And then, you know, hopefully you're better for it. Because again, like there were some quality things about it. Because like you said before NIL, right? You know, that would have been pretty cool, right? If you're a player, right, who's coming out of high school and you want to cash in early on your talent, right? Because you know, obviously in college, right, there was always the issue of, you know, let's say if a guy you know, is like in his freshman year of college, right, coming out of high school, and he doesn't do that great, so he has to stay an extra year,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or like, you know, if you do great in your first year, right, and you wanted to stay a second year, but if you wait and then you play a second year, you could get hurt, and then all of
Yeah,
a sudden your stock completely drops, you know, so
exactly.
like there's a lot of different, right, so going into the G League would erase that, assuming you played well, um, and then you can get, you know, like you can get a, you know, a I guess an early spot potentially into the NBA maybe.
True.
But yeah, but you know, it didn't work. And like I said, it's just kind of funny because when we were talking about, you know, that, you know, we didn't really think that it was all of a sudden like the G League Ignite was coming to an end like
Right.
that fast. But we were already kind of on it in the sense of like, you know, we weren't big fans of it because it's just again, it was beyond the talent level. There was just there was very little that we had heard from anywhere, right? Saying that like this is a huge success, right? Like if it was
Right.
doing really good, they'd be talking about it. You know, it's kind of like, you know, when viewership for, you know, some of the events or something are good, you know, they're always going to put it up and, you know, publicize it and be like, hey, yeah, we got record viewership for this thing or,
Right.
you know, whatever else, you know, other new things that they add in, right? Like when the play-in tournament did very well, right? They made a point to emphasize like we're gonna bring this back because this
Yeah.
did great, right? Same with the in-season tournament and all that other stuff. But you know, not every idea works.
Yeah.
Like
And yeah.
sometimes, like an idea could be a good one, but it may not actually work once you actually execute it.
Yeah, and like even looking at their stats, like we didn't even cover like anything statistically
Right,
about the G League Ignite, but their record is 2-28. So you know, the only
right,
thing that they're pretty much preparing these guys for is if you go to a bad franchise that you know may be down in the dumps for a little bit. Like they rank like offensively very low among the G League. And, you know, the roster isn't crazy. It's to really showcase a couple of guys here and there alongside some veterans.
right,
Like everybody knows who Norris Cole is. Some people may know who John Jenkins is. Like those guys are on the roster to kind of be their vets. But, you know, like I said, 2-28 is not that good. You know, rebounds per game, they're last. Points per game, one above last. So they're 29th. You know, it's not great. And like looking at the stats,
right,
like, you know, Ron Holland, he looks good. From the field, I guess it's a little sketch because, you know, he's attempting 15, 16 shots, but then 44 from the field, 24 from the three. So that kind of raises
right,
a couple of questions. Mataz, he's a little bit shaky from the three as well, but 44 from the field on 4 less shots 13 points per game, you just look at it and you don't really know how to feel. And I think that's kind of the interesting thing about the entire draft, not just the G League, is there's a lot of guys that might just be really good role players, and that's it. Like, we don't know. It all comes down to what situation they're drafted into. And even like, what is their floor and what is their ceiling going to really be? But I don't know. Like, the G League is, I mean, at least it's done, but 2-28 is not something you can like broadcast, like you were saying. You can't look at a 2-28 team and say this is successful. Like, that's Detroit Pistons level bad, Washington Wizards level bad.
Yeah. And it's supposed to be, a team like comprised of some pretty talented guys,
And
right?
these
Like
are
obviously,
exhibition
the
games. It
G
makes
League
no
talent,
sense.
right. Yeah, because like the other G League teams, it's not even like they're bad, right? Because that's comprised of like, guys that are either like drafted onto NBA teams, but they're not playing with the regular team
Right,
consistently, so they're just in the G League, or it's like the two-way guys or whatever. Right. So it's not even like the talent they're playing is bad, right?
right.
But still, 2-28 is pretty inexcusable because it's not, again, like the G League Ignite team is supposed to also have a decent amount of talent. So, like you said, that's Detroit Pistons Wizards level of bad, which that's not going to make anybody interested, right? It'd be one thing if
Yeah.
that was like a traveling team or something like the Washington Generals.
Sure.
But this is supposed to be a highlight of the NBA, of what the NBA has to offer, and it's clearly not. So better to pull the plug and then kind of figure out ways to move on than to kind of let it keep going as everybody already kind of because it would have gotten to a point where everybody would have already kind of jumped in and been like, yeah, this is not it.
Yeah. And the way that I kind of feel about it is like, I think the Ignite hurt a lot of these guys that are currently in the NBA's like development. Like, I think a couple of years from now, we'll probably be talking about Jalen Green as the legit superstar that he's projected to be. Kaminga's kind of already showing us like, yeah, like with the right development and the right team, you could potentially be, a rising star in the NBA. It's just, I think, just being on that team and during that developmental process, whatever was going on with the Ignite, I just don't think it helped a lot of those guys. So I think, down the line, they have the potential to be some really good players. It's just a matter of can they really get there because their development was kind of stagnated by the Ignite. That's just really how I feel about the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, rip to the G League Ignite.
Yeah. Rest in peace,
Probably
man.
won't miss you.
Nope.
But yeah, but again, interesting concept. So
Yeah.
now we're gonna get into just kind of a check in on some of the rookies and second year players.
Hmm.
Obviously, the season's coming to a close. We got basically 3 weeks left. So it's time to kind of just like check in and see if things have changed. Obviously, um, you know, Asor Thompson, right, his season is over, right? He had the blood clots. So his season is done, right? 63 games, 9 points, 6.5 rebounds, 2 assists, 1 steal, 1 block. Minutes kind of fluctuated over the course of the season.
Hmm.
But but I think overall, like you saw like flashes of what he can be. Because he can do a lot of stuff. Obviously, incredible athlete, just like his brother, who we'll also get to in a moment.
Oh, yeah.
But it is kind of rough because again, the biggest issue is can't shoot, right? 19, just under 19% from three, 60% from the line. And I don't know if he'll ever actually be like a good shooter because it's just like, it's one thing for, to start off as like not great, right? Like say there, are players like say some of the bigs, right, who
Hmm.
came into the league and they couldn't really shoot threes, but like, they could make free throws, they could shoot like the 15, 17 footer or whatever, and then kind of moved out to the 3-point line, right? Like Brooke Lopez, Pau Gasol, Mark Gasol, even like a LaMarcus Aldridge. But when you shoot that poorly, from three and from the free throw line, it just doesn't really feel like there's like a whole lot there. I still think he can do like but I like the fact that he can do like so many different things. So it's like, you may be able if you have a bunch of other good shooters around him, like you might be able to be okay. I mean, like I still think it'd be hard to not be like a big and not be able to shoot at all. But the fact that he can, impact the game in so many other ways, I think is still kind of a quality thing. It's just kind of wild because when he started the season, right, he was playing incredible basketball. And then his minutes just kind of dropped off. And obviously some of that was because like the team as a whole, it's just really hard to fit around because there were a lot of guys who just can't on that team in addition to him, right? Like him and Duran together, right? Like neither guy can really shoot. So that's kind of hard. And then you have like, Ivy and Cunningham as a backcourt, right? Cunningham kind of, ideally needs the ball in space, right? Ivy is a really good athlete, but also is a guy that kind of likes to play downhill and attack, right? So it's like it's not really like a great fit of guys together. But I think that there still is a lot of talent for Thompson.
Yeah, I think he's a stud. I think he's going to be, potentially a superstar. And that was kind of what we talked about.
Great
Um,
defense.
yeah, exactly. And that was what we talked about even like before he got drafted. We were talking like,
Yep.
maybe he has the potential to even eclipse his brother, who was more so touted as the offensive guy, both ends of the floor, can do it all. But it seems like Asor is more of the do it all kind of guy with the extreme focus on defense. I think if he hones out his offensive game, specifically the shooting, because I think we all know the athleticism is there, and the frame is there for sure as well. But that shooting, if that comes to fruition, my gosh, I mean, Detroit really has one on their hands, and even like Houston does with the brother as well. Like they're both really, really good.
Yeah.
I think it's surprising how good they really, really are. Because beyond statistics, like if you just watch the game, they do have an extreme impact. They hustle for every play. Like I said, the athleticism is really, really there. It shows, and the IQ is on a different level. Like both offensively and defensively, they can pull off some stuff that you don't really expect from rookies. You see a lot of rookies have a lot of blunders, and they do have blunders, but I think the positives definitely outweigh the negatives.
Yeah, and I think, for, Amen Thompson, right? It's
Hmm.
kind of funny with him where, since Shengun has gone down,
Hmm.
right? That's kind of where he's been able to, kind of shine, as of late, right? Because like he's been starting, he's been playing a big role. They're basically kind of playing him sort of as like a center,
Yeah.
of sorts, right? Where he's like, kind of in the middle dunker spot, right? Obviously, setting screens and, playing up and down, right? Because that's kind of been the key for Houston as of late, right? Because they've gone on a win streak
Yeah.
where they're just running up and down the floor every possession, um, like crazy. And that's kind of the cool thing, right? Like you look at some of these recent games, right, against the Wizards. I mean, again, they haven't played like a ton of great teams as of late, but it doesn't matter, right? Like, it's still better than what it looked, right? I mean, against the Wizards, 25 and 10
Yeah.
rebounds, right? 2 assists, a block, 13 and 8 against Cleveland. 24 and 11 against the Wizards, right? And then 13 and 5 against the Kings, right? So like a lot of, pretty impressive, games where like, early in the season I think he was hurt and just wasn't playing a whole lot. But his minutes have gone up, as the season has progressed, right? And
Yeah.
obviously since Shingun's gone down, right? Pretty much probably like a, season-ending injury. But obviously, better than what it could have been, right? Because that injury initially looked really, really bad. So I guess it's kind of fortunate that he's probably just going to be out for the remainder of the season and not out for most of next year. But like I said, as his minutes have gone up and his opportunities have increased, right now for the month of March, he's been averaging 13.7 rebounds, 2 assists on 70% true shooting, right? So that's
Yeah.
how you know,
It's
right?
pretty
He's
good.
like you mentioned, he's impacting the game in a lot of different ways. It's just kind of interesting because he came in, in the draft kind of as sort of a point guard. But he hasn't really done as much of that for Houston, and part of that's just because you have Fred VanVleet, you have Jalen Green, so you have other ball handlers in there, so there's just
Yeah.
not going to be as many ball handling opportunities. Plus, he can't shoot, so that's kind
Yeah.
of the other difficulty as well. But I think it's kind of cool how, again, much like a sword, they've kind of been able to find different roles and different ways to impact the game, and that's how they're going to be able to stick around, even if they never become good shooters. Because, like I said, I'm kind of skeptical that they're ever going to be able to be like good 3-point shooters, just because the numbers starting off are just so awful.
Yeah.
But I mean, if they could just be not 20%,
Yeah.
like, could either of them get up to, like, close to 30? Like, if you could get
Maybe.
close to 30, right, like yeah, like, maybe, but even then, like, again, it's like, I don't know. But either way, I still like a lot of other things about them regardless that I'm willing to overlook, the shooting, woes. Because again, like, it's pretty cool what they're able to do, and they just
Yeah.
won against, the Bulls, so now they've won, like, 6 in a row.
Yeah, for sure. And like with Amen, like it's so intriguing because I think I like the thing that I like most about him is probably his handles. what he's able to do with the ball in his hands, and also the way he's able to get to the rack. I really like everything about his game offensively. I'm not as high on him defensively as his brother. I think defensively his brother is definitely the better defender, but offensively I really like what Amon can do when he gets to the rack. I think, we've seen a couple of highlights where he's faked people out. He's got a great offensive bag. He knows how to use his body and his size, and it's interesting. He reminds me now of more like a point forward versus like a point guard, which is what we initially thought he was going to be coming into the draft, and that's kind of what Houston can potentially use a lot of, down the road. They do have like an intriguing young core where you have a guy like Fred VanVleet, you got Jalen Green, Jabari Smith, Şengün. Now I think Amon Thompson pretty much fits right into that mold. It's just a matter of, can he stay healthy? And like you said, can he learn to space the floor potentially and actually become a, not even like a great three-point shooter. I would just say like an average three-point shooter. Just, high 20s, hopefully.
Don't be bad.
Yeah, don't be
right
Ben
now,
Simmons, bro. Like, I think if you're on the Ben Simmons like trajectory in terms of your shooting ability and the shots that you take and don't take, I don't think that'll help the team because we've seen how that kind of works. But, I think if he can add that to his bag, like, yeah, I think they're both going to be forces to reckon with.
Right. Now, another rookie I kind of want to mention, which I don't think we really talked about him at all since the draft, and we liked him in the draft. We saw him in Vegas, and he's gotten a lot of opportunities because the team has had a really rough year. But G.G. Jackson,
True.
right? This is a guy who's had a very good rookie season. Obviously, Memphis, has been pretty bad. Obviously they've had a horrific, bad luck in terms of injuries, but I would say a bright spot, has been, him, right? Where you look at his numbers over the course of the season, right? 13 points, 4 rebounds, half a steal, half a block, 44 from the field, 37 from three, right? He had 35 against Golden State. Obviously, that was a game where they got destroyed.
Yeah.
But just in general, just the fact that it looks like you were able to find a guy in the second round that could, possibly contribute, long term, right? And he can actually shoot, which we know has been a problem, right, for Memphis. When they had like their core group of guys, right, where it was not a great 3-point shooting team. And I think again, if you're going into next season for Memphis, right, like obviously not a whole lot of bright spots, but his play, just the fact that he can kind of play on both ends of the floor somewhat, right? Because I think he was kind of viewed in college as like a scorer, right? But he sort of kind of just fit in, from the games I've seen, right, as kind of just a guy that kind of just can do a little bit of different things, right? Like I said, space the floor. I know against Golden State he was guarding Steph for a good chunk of it, right? And it wasn't like he did a crazy job, right? He got burned, a handful of times, but the fact that they're trying a lot of different things, I think would kind of show that they see a lot of promise in him. He's only 19, right? So I mean, I think he's got a really good chance to be like a solid rotational guy, and again it's wild because if Memphis had all their guys healthy for most of the year, he may not have played or gotten any opportunities, which kind of shows like you got to take advantage of the opportunities when you can get them, right? Because again, in his last several games, right, 35, 22, 19, 26, 19. So I mean, like again, the scoring is translating, right? I mean, obviously, again, he's not doing it, where it's like a lot of off the dribble, stuff like that. But the fact that like the jump shot is translated and he can play without the ball, like that helps, right? If he can continue to grow the other parts of his game, again, that's going to be a quality player that you can have on your team, regardless of whether or not he starts. Because he hasn't really started for them. He's mainly come off the bench. But still, like, again, you got to tip your cap because again, this was a guy that we liked in the draft, but we weren't necessarily sure, what he would be able to do. But so far, in a season that's been pretty bad for Memphis, he's been a guy that's been legit.
Yeah, and like the maturity arc is what I've really been impressed with because, there are a lot of concerns about, why he had fallen in the draft a lot. His draft stock completely plummeted, I think, after 1 year at South Carolina. But regardless, I didn't expect him to be such a great shooter and so efficient. I would have thought he would have been, in the maybe high 20s, but he's pushing almost 40% from the 3-point line. So hats off to him, like you said. He's fit right in as well. Like, and a lot of teams passed on this guy. And the crazy thing is, coming out of high school, he was projected to be like a top 5 pick. So for him to fall all the way to the second round, pick number 45, right into Memphis's hands is pretty phenomenal. And, like you said, now that he's had the opportunity, they know what they have with him. And, he could potentially be a, role rotational guy. And I think that alleviates some of the pressure that you are going to have when you do draft this season or in the off season. So it should be intriguing, what they do with him going forward. But yeah, this season he's been amazing for a rookie, and especially his youth and maturity. I really love it.
Yeah, 37 from 3 on basically 5 attempts a game. So I
Yeah.
mean, like, that lets you know like he's getting them up, but he's doing a good job, of knocking them down. So
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's kind of that's pretty cool because again,
Yeah, he's been
like you
balling
said, there were a lot of questions about him, and you said his stock has dropped, but he's been showing Memphis that was a really quality pick. So
for
it's
sure.
good to see. Obviously there's other rookies that we've talked about, guys like Jaquez, Pajemski. Keontae George, right? That's a guy that we hadn't really talked about a whole lot,
Mm-hmm.
right? That was a guy, that I think people were, you know, some people were high on in the draft and then others not so much.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, again, for a guy that's a rookie, it's kind of wild, how productive he's actually been, for the Utah Jazz this year. Again, another team where it hasn't really been like a ton of super positive stuff. And again, from the field, 40%, not great. But it is also like a strange team. So that's kind of the other thing. But I think he's shown like he's a pretty good scorer.
Yeah.
And obviously, like I don't care too much about efficiency personally as a rookie, just from the perspective of it's literally your first year in the NBA, so you're getting used to the NBA defense, and the point guard position is one of the toughest
So
positions,
tough, bro.
to figure out. Yeah, if not the toughest position to figure out in the NBA. So, and again, he's also a guy where he's like what, like 6'3", 6'4".
Yeah,
So
he's
I
six
mean,
four. Yeah.
like, yeah, exactly. But either way, he's shown that he can shoot 35 from 3 on 6 attempts a game. The playmaking, right? 4.5 assists a game, 2.2 turnovers, right? You would assume that would get better. And again, Utah, it's been kind of a disappointing year. But I think in fairness to him, he's still been a bright spot. And that was clearly a quality pick for Utah because again, I think he was a guy. I think he was drafted 16th.
Yeah.
And like I said, he was a guy that people were kind of mixed on because there were people who did like him a lot, but weren't necessarily sure how his skills were going to translate. And then there were others who were just thought that he probably wasn't going to be that great.
Right.
But I think he was a pick that we both liked. But again, I think we still kind of slept on him a little bit.
Well, yeah.
And he's definitely, yeah. And I think he's, shown that like he's a legitimate player in this league.
Yeah, and I think going back to when we did our mock draft stuff, I talked about him, and I always thought that he'd chosen the wrong kind of program to go to for college basketball. I just didn't think they utilized him correctly because I remember in high school he was a phenomenal scorer. He was pretty much an automatic bucket. But at the NBA level, like, speaking to the efficiency, I think it's kind of wild, 35% from the three, but he's also taking around like 6 of those. And then also he's taking around 11 shots per game. So more than half of his shots are threes. So that I think that's why his efficiency is down. But regardless, I've been really impressed with the playmaking IQ. I've seen some crazy stuff from him, including, I think he was going up for a layup and then decided to change the layup into a lob off the backboard to Colin Sexton because Colin Sexton called for the lob.
Yep.
It's just things like that you don't really see. I think that you see that like once in a blue moon where a rookie comes out and makes a play like that. Although, you're on Utah Jazz, they don't really have much going for them this season, but I think potentially, I think he's a steal at this point. I think it's safe to say. Definitely one of the more raw guys, where like you said, the counting stats don't look too great right now, but I think down the line, if he can get more efficient, learn to handle the ball a little bit better, continue to make the amazing plays that he does when he has the ball at his hands, but also just be a little bit smarter. I think, Utah's got one. That's all I'm going to say on him.
Right. Yeah, exactly. What do you think of Tamani Kamara, right? For
Mm.
Portland, because he's kind of a guy where it's like, some of the stats, like in
Mm-hmm.
terms of the shooting, are not that great.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of people are pretty impressed by like his kind of all around game, where he can, grab some rebounds, he can defend and kind of do a little bit of everything. And people, and some people kind of have thought about like the fact that like Phoenix kind of just gave him up, right? Just kind of threw him away, to another team.
Yeah.
And maybe he could have been like, a spot rotational guy. Not that he'd be like a playoff guy, but what do you think of his game? Because he's kind of like another guy that I think, has kind of turned some heads this season where I don't think people really expected. I don't think as many people expected much out of him.
Hmm.
But he's gotten a lot of opportunities in Portland because they've just had so many guys out due to injury
Yeah, and
at
like
different
like
points.
you said, his minute spread I think is the main thing. Like in his 24 minutes, he's averaging, 7 points per game, about 5 rebounds, 2 assists, 44% from the field, but I think the key is like this isn't a superstar. I think that's pretty good for a role player rookie, pretty much. Like I think there's potential for him
Yeah,
to have a lot of upside. I think even if he gets even more efficient as time goes on from the 3-point line, we could be looking at him more so like a somewhat of a guy like a Keegan Murray, where he has that kind of impact, where he could be, a shooter, but also do more things like grab rebounds, assist, play make a little bit, also play a little bit of defense. He's not the greatest defender, but he's solid enough to the point where he just doesn't get, pretty much bulldozed around or blown by all the time. So I think he does provide a lot. It's unfortunate that he's on a bad team. I think if he was on a better team, with more going for it, this season, we'd probably be talking about him a little bit differently. But I like his game, and I think it's promising for a rookie.
yeah, yeah. I think kind of what you said kind of hit the nail on the head, where it's like he's a role player, and like those are solid stats, for a guy where it's like again he was a late second round pick
Yeah,
or whatever. So you're not really expecting. Yeah, so it's not like you're expecting like a star player in that. And every team needs those type of guys that can do a little bit of, everything, especially, a defensive guy that can also rebound.
for
And he's
sure.
like 6'7", so it's not like he's a big guy, but like clearly a guy that could probably play like both forward positions, if you want
Yes,
to go
sir.
small or whatever. So I think that's kind of the big thing, like you said, like a solid role player. Obviously, we'll see, if he continues to, play as Portland adds more talent. But just as a whole, right? Like again, when you're looking at the draft, right? Especially when you're talking about late in the second round, like towards the end of the draft, you're just looking for guys that can contribute, on some level, right? Like
Yeah,
you're not going into the 50th pick of the draft expecting, a top 5 player. You're
right.
looking for a guy that could at least be a part of your rotation and contribute, in some way, shape, or form. And like you said, I think he's been doing that, as a role guy, which makes a lot of
Absolutely.
sense. So that's
Yeah.
pretty good, I think.
Yes, sir.
Because again, it was a guy that I don't know how many people even like. I don't know how many people were high or low on him like coming into the draft. He wasn't really like a big name or anything, and he was obviously older than most guys in this draft because he's 23.
Yeah. I think a lot of people were more so honed in on the other Portland guy. I think his name was Ryan Repair or whatever, but he hasn't really even played. Like, that's the intriguing part. So hey, sometimes, you're overlooked. And I think that's the intriguing part of his NBA journey, is that he was pretty much overlooked entirely by almost all of the NBA, including the team that drafted him. But regardless, hey, it is what it is.
Yeah. So like, are there any other rookies that have kind of caught your eye? Because obviously we haven't done like all NBA, all defense, all rookie
Right.
yet. But like, are there any other rookies you're thinking of, or even like a second year guy or third year guy?
I mean, like in terms of the rookies, like I mean, the stuff kind of goes unsaid. Like we feel great about Chet, we feel great about Wemby. Obviously, like those are kind of
Yeah.
guys that we don't even really need to talk about. I think this is more to shed a light on
Right.
some guys that maybe don't get talked about as much. Like I like Cam Whitmore's game. I think he's done a lot for Houston. I think he fits that culture. I think Udoka really likes him. He seems to give him a lot of minutes. I'm trying to think of who else. I think it would have been Derek Lively. I like Derek Lively a lot. That's another guy that I think adds a lot to what Dallas does. But I think the guy who's not talked about enough, even though he went so high, is really Brandon Miller. I think his stats have been pretty good recently. I think he's lived up to the hype somewhat in terms of him being basically the second coming of Paul George. He's got the athleticism. He's got the 3-point shot. He's got the bag. He's off to a great start. Like 16 points per game. He's averaging. The rebounds aren't that amazing for his height, I think, but 4 rebounds, 2 assists, 36% from the 3-point line, 43 from the field. I think he's just done a lot, and I think he's kind of kept Charlotte relevant with LaMelo in and out and stuff like that. So I think you feel good about Brandon Miller and what he's done, because I know a lot of people were really like pissed off
Yeah.
with him getting picked where he got picked. But
Right.
I think it's a good
He's
pick,
been
and I think it'll pay off in the long run because he's been really, really good.
right.
Underrated at this point, which
And
is
again,
crazy.
that's that's kind of what we talked about, prior to the draft and even going in. You're like, when we were making our picks, right? Because like you had him at 2,
Yeah,
and I had him at 3.
you're right.
But I always prefaced it by saying my thought process was he was going to come in and be probably the better player right out of the gate, right? The more
Right.
NBA ready guy, and he clearly has been the more NBA ready player out of the gate. It'll be interesting to see like who ends up ultimately, being the better player, has the better career. But I think if you're Charlotte, which again is kind of out where I lean, where I'm like, I'm not going to be mad about taking Brandon Miller because I think he's a talented player. Like, and he
Right.
clearly has been a talented guy. Obviously, for Charlotte, there haven't been a whole lot of bright spots, mainly because LaMelo's been hurt. Others have been hurt as well. It's just been a bad year. I think they did a good job at the trade deadline, kind of, shipping guys out and creating, some cap space and more opportunities for their other young guys and just kind of starting to reset the culture and rebuild.
Yeah.
But, one bright spot you can definitely look at, like you mentioned, is Brandon Miller, because that's a guy, like you said, that caught a lot of flack from a lot of, people, that were looking at the guys coming in and thinking like, what are these idiots doing taking him at number 2? He's not going to be good. Obviously, when he had the summer league, right, everybody had a lot of eyes on him, and he had a lot of issues in the summer league in terms of
Mm-hmm.
foul trouble,
Mm-hmm.
um, and kind of inconsistencies in terms of his
Mm-hmm.
play. And again, my thought process is like summer league matters until it doesn't. Like, because
True.
it's like the preseason where like I think a lot of times we can be kind of fooled by what we see in the summer league and in preseason. It's happened to us. It's happened to many other people,
Yeah.
right? Where you see something early on and like you think it is something and then it ultimately isn't, right? And it's just like his game has translated very well. I mean, you can see why it made a lot of sense for Charlotte to take him because again, those type of guys don't come around often, right? A guy that's basically like you said, like a Paul George type player with, who's 6'9", very skilled, very smooth game, very athletic, right? Like
Yes.
those are the type of players that it's really hard to pass up on. And if you can get a guy like that and he's actually good, then you got something really going there, right? Because now
Pairing
you
with
can at least
LaMelo
say
too. It's
you have
amazing.
right. Yeah, because you have Brandon Miller, you have Mark Williams, who's been solid. He's had back issues this
Yes.
season, but when he's been on the court, he had a very productive rookie year. LaMelo, I think it's going to be interesting, right? Because now Charlotte's at the point where now he's going to be, his new contract is going to start kicking in. So now it's going to be probably harder to add talent aside from the draft, right? Because ideally, you'd like to get some guys in there before the contract kicks in,
Yeah.
so that way, you can afford to pay a bunch of guys, right? Because at a certain point, whatever talent Charlotte accumulates, they may not keep everybody. But I think at the very least, Brandon Miller is certainly a keeper. Um, and hopefully, whenever Lamelo comes back, next season or whatever, because I know he's not like been ruled out, but he's played such so few games
Yeah.
that it's basically been a lost season for him. You just kind of hope that he can at some point figure it out and stay healthy, because when he plays, he's really good. And again, you would think of the pairing between him and Brandon Miller should be really good, because again, Miller's a guy who can play off a Lamelo ball, feed off of his playmaking and energy, and you can play up and down basketball with that and entertaining basketball. Because
For
if you've
sure.
had the opportunity to watch a Brandon Miller game where he just goes off, like he can kind of single handedly make the Hornets entertaining, even regardless of whether or not Lamelo Ball's in there. Because I remember a game I saw earlier this season where it was against the Lakers, right? And he just, he had one of those games where he just had stretches where he was hitting tough shots off the dribble, he
Mm-hmm.
was getting to the rim, he was finishing.
Mm-hmm.
Again, he's a fun player, and it seems like Charlotte, now they've got a good one. Obviously, they've got new management and ownership, so we'll see, kind of where that goes.
Yeah, I think they definitely hit on that, and like a couple of other guys that I wanted to mention, like you already mentioned them briefly earlier, but some rookies that kind of don't really even look like rookies, even though they are, like a guy like Hawkes, Pajemski, like these
Right.
guys are on contending teams, and they're providing some serious minutes and serious rotational aspects to the games of these teams, and it's just wild to think about how mature these guys do really look, for where they were picked and where they are in terms of the franchises that did pick them. I think another guy would have been like Jordan Hawkins, although he doesn't play as much, but when they were pretty much rendered useless because they had nobody available in terms of health, Jordan Hawkins stepped up and he looked like
Yeah.
he fit the part. So That's kind of what I think this draft has. I think there's a lot of talent at the top, but I think there's even so much more untapped talent towards the bottom as well. Like even like a guy like Bilal Koulibaly, where you can see the potential as a project, but if he
Yeah,
figures out the shot, kind of like a Soar, if he figures out his jump shot, alongside maybe some more ball handling stuff like that, I mean, these guys could be real forces that these other young guys are going to have to deal with their entire career. So I'm really hyped for this class. I think overall it's a really good class, and I can't wait to revisit it
yeah,
next year.
yeah, and I think Bilal is further on in his shot than
Oh
like
yeah, yeah,
say
yeah.
Thomas, right?
Light years ahead.
Yeah, like yeah, like his season ended, with the wrist fracture. He played 63 games. He shot, 34.5%,
Mm-hmm.
as a rookie, which I think, it had dipped, from where
Yeah,
it was at different points in this. But like, that's you'll take that, as a as a 18, 19-year-old rookie,
yeah,
who had kind of just recently, who's still learning the game, right? So like I think you'll take that, from a guy like that, right? Like that's a quality, pick by the Wizards. Maybe you might say it's too high, but like either way, right? Like the Wizards have had, they've had kind of an up and down history with their draft picks, as you know, right? Because that's your team.
yeah.
So
We
the
tend to
fact that it seems
overdraft,
like,
overpay,
the
at
fact,
all the above.
right? Yeah. So yeah, like you said, it's been a really good draft class, and I think it was kind of interesting, right? Because the narrative coming into the draft was that it was basically like two, three guys, and then after that, right, like no one else that would probably project as like a star or anything, but it was a lot of players that could probably help some teams right away. And that's kind of what
Right.
we have seen, right? Where like you mentioned, even guys like Jaquez, or Pajemski, right? Like you said, those are guys that are playing key minutes, on teams that are, trying to win games. So, um, and they've been productive players. So, that's kind of how you look at it, where it's like, I think a lot of people were kind of, you know, were kind of right about, this draft. Obviously, you don't want to just, put a bow on it like, 1 year in, not even one season in.
Sure.
But I think so far it's been pretty impressive what we've seen from these guys. And like even like Wemby has been even better than I think you would have expected. As good as what, a lot of people thought he was gonna be. I mean, the guy's averaging 20 and 10 every night, right? Leading the
Yeah.
league in blocks. Literally a candidate for defensive player of the year as a rookie. So I think, even him, right, has been, way better than I think expected, which, again, for a team like the Spurs, that's what you want, right? Because again, we kind of thought going in that his defense would be further along than his offense. I guess in some ways it kind of has, but like even so, like he's still averaging 20 and 10 every game for a terrible team.
Yeah.
So I
It's
mean,
amazing what he's been able to
that
accomplish.
right, exactly. So hopefully, the class continues to, as they get better and better, continue to progress even more. Because I think that's kind of what we're hoping to get from a lot of these guys. Because we want
Absolutely.
guys that are really good and very productive for their teams. And so far, I think we've gotten a lot of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Next up, right? So LeBron and JJ Redick, right? They've launched their new podcast, Mind the Game, right? Obviously the
Hmm.
first episode kind of came out, right? And obviously, this is kind of something that I think a lot of people were really intrigued by, right? Obviously, there's going to be, comments both positive and negative because of, the guys involved, mainly LeBron. But, um, it's just kind of funny, right? Because again, when you're talking about, the podcast, right? It's more of an X's and O's, leaning podcast, which, in a way kind of makes sense, right? Because, obviously Reddick has kind of established himself, as a big X's and O's, guy post playing career, right? That's kind of his brand. And then obviously you kind of assume LeBron would be a pretty good X's and O's guy, right? Because everybody knows, that he's got, a great basketball IQ, probably the best of anybody. Um, so, I think it's always kind of interesting, right, to hear, a podcast from a guy like LeBron because you don't always have like, some of the top players, you know, be in a podcast, right? Like, like like Giannis, right? Or like a Jokic, or like a Tatum or Luca or whatever, right? Like you don't, those guys aren't really in podcasts. And obviously like they're at different points in their careers, but still, I think it was really cool, to kind of get some insight. They were breaking down, like different plays, right? Like, LeBron was talking about, like a thing that, Darvin kind of was doing, right? He also kind of mentioned like the Clippers comeback and stuff like that, from earlier in the season. So I thought it was kind of a really cool, introduction, to kind of what you would probably be getting, So it's got my endorsement, I guess.
Yeah, I'm hooked. Like off rip, I'm hooked. It's
Yeah,
amazing because I think this is something that NBA fans have wanted to see for a long time is to literally hear LeBron
right,
talk about basketball at nauseum, where it's like nonstop. He controls what he's being talked to about. It's not like he's being interviewed or anything like that. It's not like a locker room scrum or anything like that. Like this is all in his control, and I love it because I think we've kind of seen him do some stuff with, I think it was Uninterrupted or whatever, and then also I think it was what the
and he's been
shop,
on
yeah, and he's
yeah,
done
and he's been
guest
on the
appearances
podcast.
and things like that. But to see him in his own environment is really cool, and I think JJ Redick is a great co-host. I think those two guys, that's kind of like a unlikely pairing. Like who would have ever thought we'd be getting a LeBron and JJ Redick? Like they kind of juxtapose each other, but they both share so much
Right,
knowledge. They're both basketball junkies, clearly, and they're both great in the respective fields that they played in. In terms of JJ Redick being one of the best spot up shooters and shooters of all time, and you've got LeBron being one of the best, if not the best player of all time. It's really cool. But like you said, to see a more X's and O's podcast from these two guys is really, really phenomenal because, we've talked about JJ Redick. He's more of an X and O's guy. And then also LeBron is clearly a basketball junkie as well. So he's going to tap
yeah,
into that. But to see that and it not be something, I guess, like dumbed down and like more
right,
casual, it's really intriguing. And it reminds me more so of like a TV show than a podcast. Like now I'm going to be like tuned in, like, every single
right,
time, like whether it's like an update, a surprise drop, or anything like that. Like I'm tuned in, and it's
right.
fire. I would definitely suggest everybody goes and checks it out because the first episode was really, really good. Loved it.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me, I think it was ESPN, right, where they did the detail thing, where I think it was Kobe, and he was breaking
Yeah,
down,
yeah, you're right.
like film, sort of, right. Obviously, like, this is different. This is more like a discussion
True,
as opposed to like just gonna have film, but like still, it kind of reminds you of that, where it's like one of the game's best, kind of just breaking down stuff, and talking about it. Because again, like you said, right, like there's, obviously there's been a lot of discussions, especially this year about, like the kind of the debate between, more casual oriented content versus like more X's and O's, kind of like hardcore, like you said, basketball junkie type of content. And I think
hmm,
there's room for both. But I think it's kind of cool to get like an X's and O's one from an actual player,
yeah,
because again, like these guys, they live and breathe this stuff, every day basically. So because again, you don't normally get something like that, from those type of guys. Obviously, like Draymond can do that. um, he has a podcast as well, right? And he's kind of one of the best at doing that as well, right?
for
But like,
sure.
just in terms of like in terms of where he ranks as a player, right? Like, people don't, put him in like the same sphere as some of these other guys, right?
Right.
Just in terms of he's not looked at as like a top 10,
Yeah.
player or whatever. So I think it's kind of cool to get that perspective. And like you said, it's an odd pairing because when I first heard it, I was kind of surprised where it's like I wouldn't have expected that, like you said, but it works because again, it's very clear, right, that like, both of those guys, you know, have a lane and have a lot of, knowledge
They
about,
know ball,
what it
bro.
is that they do, which exactly, which is, again, I think there's always something to be said for, that kind of content. I think it can be, if it's done right, I think it can be really good,
Yeah.
as with anything.
And I feel like it's so authentic because I mean we could talk about all the NBA players in their podcasts. Like I like D'Lo's. It's more so kind of like influencer like, where he gives us behind the scenes stuff, tours and
Yeah.
interviews and pretty good guests. And you have guys like John Wall, where he brings on his guests, talks about his life experiences
Yep.
and things
Yep.
of that nature. Jeff Teague, like you just said, he's got a comedic one. That one's pretty funny, where they pretty much share NBA stories. Have some good guests on there as well. You got even other people like
Arenas.
yeah, Arenas, I was gonna say his, and he's more like geared towards, I guess, like a more mature audience because he doesn't really care. Like he doesn't give to know what. So you know I think it's interesting that everybody's found their lane, and I think this is the perfect one for LeBron and JJ Redick to kind of just carve their niche and then watch as like and just reap the benefits because it's really intriguing. Because initially, when I first saw like clips of it, I thought LeBron was like a guest on JJ Redick's podcast or something like that. I was like, oh, okay, cool. JJ Redick like bagged LeBron James for a freaking interview. That's amazing. But then I was like, oh, whoa,
Yeah.
this is a real deal like thing, and we're gonna see like episodes weekly. That's fire, man.
And like you said, like that's the cool part is that, you get to hear from one of the game's best. Because again, he doesn't always, like make appearances like, on podcasts or whatever. Obviously, he's been on some, but
Yeah,
there are other guys that like think have more frequent, guest appearances on whatever. But it's kind of cool that he's kind of delving into that realm because again, like, nowadays there's so much more, there's a lot of demand for this type of content. And if you're, either a current or former player or whatever, right? Like, and especially if you can find people, you know, to help you out or, just, find opportunities or whatever, like you have an advantage, right? Because again, like people would want to hear LeBron, talk about basketball because, as we've already said, and as we've said multiple times, and as others have said, right, he's one of the smartest minds to ever play the game.
for sure.
So, you kind of want to know, you want to hear like, what is he thinking? You know, um, when he's, kind of analyzing stuff. Cause, like sometimes players are mic'd up, but it's not like, it's not the full experience that you would normally get, right? Cause, like you don't hear them over the course of the game. You're not hearing them like reading out all the plays and whatnot. You just wouldn't. But,
Right.
to get an opportunity like that, that's kind of a rare opportunity. So I think that's pretty cool. And,
Yeah.
like you had said, I would definitely recommend people watch that. Especially if they kind of want to learn, or kind of get more into X's and O's content.
Yeah, missed opportunity to call it Le Podcast, but that's the only thing that I probably hate about it.
Yeah. Um. Yeah. So now, in terms of news and rumors, obviously not really, like a ton of stuff going around. Obviously just because, again, obviously trade deadline, that's been since ended, right? Buyout
Yeah.
stuff that's pretty much done, right? So we're kind of just going into the playoffs. So obviously there may be some rumors going around. There's been some talk about the idea of like I think Philadelphia, was interested in Paul George. That was from Mark Stein. Because he's going to hit free agency at the end of the season. I still think he probably signed some type of extension or re-ups or whatever with the Clippers. Maybe some of that may depend on what they do. You know, come playoff time, right? Like obviously, if they win a championship, right, like he's gonna stay, he's gonna resign. Um, but they haven't played as well recently. And they're kind of in a world where, obviously they had the cool stuff, the other night, right, against the Blazers. With the Harden contest thing, which was
Yeah.
just kind of funny, I
Yeah, it
guess.
was
But
awkward.
either way, but either way, they haven't played. Yeah, but I mean, either way, they haven't played as well recently. So you kind of wonder, what reasoning is that? Maybe because it's an older team, they're just kind of just, a little fatigued, so they're just kind of taking it easy, right? Where they know we're probably not going to be able to get a top three seed, and we're probably not going to fall beyond like five, so we might as well just kind of just chill, stay where we're at. I think some of the injuries that they've had to guys haven't helped, right? Like Westbrook being hurt, I think is kind of a sneaky tough loss for them because he's a big energy guy. Even though he hadn't, right before the injury, he had started to not play as well. But he always plays hard with a high motor, and I think that can kind of help them in games where like the energy's just kind of flat because again, it's an older team. Even though he's one of the oldest guys on the team, um, which is kind of funny, but it speaks to the energy he brings. But either way, I think for the Clippers, as long as they have like a quality playoff run, I would imagine he still re-ups, right? Like, I mean, even if they just like get flat out embarrassed, I just don't think he's gonna leave.
Mm.
And especially like if you're the Clippers, you have no means of replacing him if he does leave because they're not gonna have cap space, I don't think. So my guess is that he still probably resigns. Obviously it could also depend on like if the Clippers just decide to break it up. But I mean, they just gave Kawhi an extension. So I can't imagine that they would do all that after that. So I feel like it may just be a little bit of like, not that it's not true, but in the sense of like, I still think he'll re-sign with the Clippers. But obviously, if they lose in the first round again, right? Then obviously, anything, can kind of be open at that point, right? Where like, you're kind of wondering what they're gonna do because there's only but so many more years that they probably have left in terms of this window. Because now these guys are an older group, and you don't have much room to, really change the group, right? Like you don't have the flexibility to like just bring in another guy unless you trade one of those guys. So it's something to watch, but it's kind of like the Clay thing where I think he resigns with Golden State. I just don't really see Paul George leaving. I guess if he does, Philly will have cap space, but I mean, is that really going to be much better than what you're doing in with the Clippers right now? Maybe. But I guess you're playing with quote unquote younger guys, but still.
Yeah, the thing is like, he's going to be eligible for a max contract extension, right? Um,
Right.
I guess it would probably, I think that they're probably going to dangle that over his head, unfortunately, and make it contingent on, their playoff success. Maybe it's like, if they get a deep run,
Hmm.
okay, yeah, cool, we can run it back. But, say they flame out,
Right.
there might not be a point. Because I know a lot of people have said this, and this is a direct quote. Presumably, if there was a max extension sitting around for him, he would have signed it by now, which I think has some truth to it. Where I think there is a little bit of
Right.
skepticism between the duo, and I think at this point you probably want Kawhi over Paul George. So if you had to let somebody walk, it would be Paul George. I don't think you would feel great about it, but you might have to do it just in terms of avoiding the tax and things like that. Or at least avoiding being too deep into the tax. But regardless, I mean, if I were in this situation, I mean, I would do everything in my power to retain Paul George and keep him there. And I think Paul George should kind of do the same thing and do his best to stay there because I think it's a good situation, win or lose. I just don't really think he would be that much better off in Philly. I think maybe Philly would feel different, but I don't think you and I probably feel
Right.
any different.
Right. Yeah. Like I don't think it's going to be much different than what it already is. The
Right.
only difference now is that he's 33. He's going to be 34
Yeah.
going into next season. Right. So that would be something to think about where if you give him, that max extension or whatever, let's say it's like, a 3-year deal, right? You're paying for him into his year like 35, 36, 37 season or whatever. And just what version are you going to get? He's obviously been playing pretty well this season. He's not played as well as of late, right? Like if you look at his splits, from like earlier versus like what he's been doing, recently, it's not quite as ideal as you would like. Obviously we already said for the Clippers, as long as Kawhi continues to play well, you just need like one of George or Harden to play pretty well. I think
Yeah.
offensively, right? And Paul George will play good defense. But I don't know. Like I don't feel quite as good about them as I did earlier in the year. But either way, like there could be just a lot of just weird stuff behind it. I mean, like, you look at March, right? He's averaging 24, 5 and 4. It was the February stretch where he was like 18 and 5 or
Right.
whatever it was, where he's shooting like 40 from the field. But just as a whole, the team has been 500, right? And they weren't gonna match, that level of play from earlier where they were like 33 and 11 or whatever it was. That's an unsustainable rate. I mean, like you're talking about basically 75, a 75% winning clip, right? Like that over the course of a season, that's probably not going to happen.
Right.
But um, I don't know. Like I still think they can do some damage in the playoffs. Like I've still kind of gone to like now, like compared to like maybe where I was like a couple months ago, where I think it's still going to be the Nuggets. But the Clippers, if they're healthy, should have a good shot. I think they probably have the next best shot compared to any of these other teams. Because I think the main argument you would have made for the Clippers is the consistency, right? Because like people have made cases for teams like say Dallas or Phoenix,
Sure.
potentially to be really scary teams that could compete against the Nuggets. It's just the issue is like for every solid stretch those teams have, then they have other stretches where they're not that great, right? Like Dallas has been great as of late, but they had a stretch like a few weeks ago where they weren't playing so good, right? Phoenix, had that stretch where we were talking about them, being potentially formidable against the Nuggets. But now they basically played 500 basketball despite all their guys pretty much being healthy. So, that doesn't feel great either. But, again, if you're the Clippers, like, what other option do you really have? Because, again, it's like I already said, if Paul George walks, you can't replace him, right? And you've already given up a ton of picks. So you don't really have much of a future anyway. So you might as well just kind of just run with it until it's
Keep him,
basically
bro.
milk was dry. Like, I mean,
Keep
that's
him.
pretty much all you can really do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what I
so
would say. Is
that's
just
what I'm
keep him,
like.
bro.
Yeah, yeah. And I just don't see a scenario where he leaves unless the Clippers just like, lowball him, But again, like I doubt they would do that because, you know, Kawhi is here because, Kawhi and Paul George came here together. I'd be surprised if they kind of broke it up, with the only possible scenario where that happens is if like they flame out or something like that,
Yeah,
which, who knows? Because again, like, they've not been as good as of late. The team that they're kind of right there with, New Orleans, has been playing much better as of late, although they just had a bad Brandon Ingram injury, so we'll see where that goes. But yeah, like we'll see.
yeah. I'm very curious, but it is something to watch.
Yeah, you're right. Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts, in the comments about, the G League Ignite. Um, about the rookies and, everything else we've discussed up to this point. Obviously we still want to continue to say thanks for, all the viewership and the likes. Again, that was one of our best performing videos in quite some time. As we mentioned before, if you leave a comment, on the video or, whenever we post, on our socials, we'll read it at the beginning of the video. We'll pick one and continue to like, comment, and subscribe. We appreciate all the support, and we'll see you Monday.